with militant right-wing Christianity on the rise, I think it's time that we revisit an old subject. What is the relationship between paganism and Christianity? I think it's safe to say that most heathens and pagans, particularly those who are in the United States of America, have some pretty strong and sometimes spicy opinions about Christianity. Some of this is a product of many modern practitioners of paganism and heathenry coming out of different forms of Christianity, particularly high control and abusive ones that are becoming increasingly popular and influential in society today. Part of it, I think, is also because we live in a society that is under Christian hegemony, which means that even though we are not officially living in a world where Christianity is the state religion of many places, or at least not in a fashion that's meaningful. I'm fairly sure that if you talk to most people in the United Kingdom about the role of the Anglican Church, they're not going to be viewing it as this incredibly powerful and vital institution that impacts every part of their lives, even though it is officially the state religion of the United Kingdom. But rather, when I say hegemony, I mean a dominant position with pervasive influence that is built on centuries of the role that Christianity has exercised in the societies of Europe, the Americas, and other places that have been colonized by European powers. There are also deep spiritual objections to a lot of the core ideas of Christianity that exist within modern pagan and heathen practices. I mean, if there weren't, then the people engaging in those spiritual practices wouldn't be pagans and heathens in the first place. Why, after all, would you choose to follow a religious movement that uses terminology and engages in practices and ideas that are, in many ways, very far removed from conventional religion, unless you had deep, abiding reasons to do so? Now, that said, what I'm going to be doing here is not so much getting into that in greater detail, but rather unpacking what exactly is the relationship between paganism as a concept and Christianity as a broad religious force within the world today, as well as how it has historically developed. I think that if we as heathens and pagans are going to truly understand where it is we exist in this world that has been defined by Christian norms for hundreds, in some places, over 1,000 years, then we need to really wrestle with what it is that Christians mean when they say the word pagan, and generally what the word has come to mean within broader society, and what that represents for us. Now, this is going to be the first of, you could say, a deliberate triptych of episodes where I'm going to get a bit more into what that means for pagans in my next regular episode in August, so that we can focus in this episode much more on what I would call the pagans and the Christians, what this relationship is all about, and what's going on in these terms that are being used. I'm going to start by unpacking the word pagan, what it means and where it comes from, as well as the word heathen, which is often used in a similar fashion, at least in the English-speaking world. I'll then discuss the coming of Christianity, how it became the dominant religion within the Roman Empire, and then what it did within Europe to these various different pre-Christian religions that existed in the European subcontinent and the Mediterranean basin. Along the way, we're also going to get into a very critical myth that sort of is central to Christianity's legitimacy. The idea that Christianity's coming was voluntarily accepted and treated as a genuine improvement over what came before, which, as we'll see when I get into the history a bit, is much more a nice story than something that's genuinely rooted in fact. I'll then get into modern Christianity and the modern pagan movement, which, as I'm going to talk about when we get there, could be seen as something of a story of dogs and cats. And don't worry, I'll explain that a little bit further down the line. So put a pin in that for now. I'll then wrap up with where this leaves modern pagans and help set things up for the August episode, which will dive more into the pagan side of this bigger story. So let's kick it off with, what is pagan? The word pagan is derived from the Latin paganus, which generally speaking tends to translate as something along the lines of redneck or hillbilly. The term itself doesn't really start to enter common usage until Christianity becomes a significant force within the Roman Empire. This is also why paganus, as a term, has these kind of class regionalist connotations. Christianity and the Roman Empire, as well as civic life within the Roman Empire, tend to be urban-focused, meaning the peoples who were the latest and slowest in coming to Christianity, at least in the eyes of the church, were groups that were in more rural areas, that were further away from Roman civic life and less likely to feel the impacts of the conversion of the empire in their day-to-day existence. This is not a term of self-identification, by the way. The Romans, the Greeks, the other Latin-speaking groups that existed within the Mediterranean basin during the times of the Roman Empire did not call themselves pagans. For them, the understanding and concept of religion was something that was pretty different from what exists today. And a big part of this is because Roman polytheism, as well as Hellenic forms of polytheism and the other polytheisms that existed within Western Europe and the Mediterranean world, were very porous and inclusive. There's all kinds of evidence of things like the hybrid gods like Serapis, who I've talked about before, in Egypt, and the Interpretatio Romanum, which was this whole system where Romans came up with ways of explaining how certain gods of other groups were actually their understandings of their particular gods. Like, there's definitely some cultural and religious imperialism going on there, but it's something that doesn't exactly negate the existence of these other gods entirely. At the time of Constantine and his edicts of toleration, one of the biggest rivals in terms of scope, influence, estimated size, and all that for the spiritual affections of the Roman Empire to Christianity was, interestingly enough, the cult of Isis, which was widespread, and there's examples of worship of the cult going well into 5th century Rome itself, well after the conversion of the empire. There certainly was a sense of adhering to the gods of the Roman state, because in these societies, which gods were adhered to and interacted with was very much a political question. This, by the way, was part of why Christians were initially persecuted in the Roman Empire, was because, in part, refusing to give homage to the imperial cult was seen as an act of sedition. But aside from a sense of there being the gods of the particular dominant power in the region, there isn't this same sense that you get with the coming of Christianity of there being distinct hard lines between specific forms of religious worship that were deeply embedded within someone's identity. This is not to say that worshipping foreign gods was necessarily completely okay within the Roman Empire. There's lots of examples, including the cases of both Julius and Augustus Caesar, of the interactions with foreign deities being used in a way that, for modern Americans kind of rings anywhere from accusing somebody of being anti-Christian to accusing them of being a communist or a socialist. In other words, a really easy way to quickly discredit somebody for a large swath of the population. But anyway, the point is, the term pagan is something that begins to develop because of the conversion of the Roman Empire and this creation of a new sense of identity where Christianity has become the dominant force, and pagans are effectively cast as the other. And by the way, when I'm using pagan in this sense, I'm talking a small p, because these are not people who you could describe as being a part of or connected to the modern movement. They are certainly peoples that the modern movement draws inspiration from, but it would not be appropriate to put them in the same way because their understanding of religious practice was significantly different, and it's also of a product of a time before Christianity sort of brutally reshaped how we understand the concept of religion and spirituality. The use of the word pagan and also the similar term heathen as a sort of catch-all, this is everything Christianity is not term, is really critical for understanding the pagan use of the word, because in a lot of ways you could see it as reclamation of something that is kind of, situationally often used as a slur, or at least as a term to diminish the validity of a spiritual practice other than Christianity. The use of the term pagan in this sense is one that is understandable as sort of a place of getting started, because that was the term that's used in source materials for talking about these different pre-Christian groups that were eventually subsumed into what becomes Christendom. The fact that it has persisted, however, is something that I think carries a bit more significance. Identifying as pagan, keeping in mind that it isn't just a catch-all term assigned by Christians for describing anything that's not Christian, it is also one that has a certain loaded meaning of being everything Christianity is not. Nothing better demonstrates this than the whole recent fracas around the Paris Olympic opening ceremonies, which included things like the French metal band Gojira performing a song from the French Revolution while a headless Marie Antoinette sang the lyrics, and a recreation of a painting known as the Feast of the Gods, or the Banquet of the Gods, where a group of performers were dressed up as figures from that painting and recreated it in life. Now, the Feast of the Gods is a subject of a lot of different paintings by French artists, including some very specific ones that this is calling back to from the late Renaissance and early Baroque. The point is, these things that are going on are very French. This did not stop the usual bunch from manufacturing all kinds of outrage and fury and demanding boycotts against the Olympics, with luminaries like human trafficker Andrew Tate jumping in to denounce all of this as being satanic. This is something that I think is interesting, because it wasn't just Tate who accused it of being satanic, because that's the other catch-all term that exists within Christianity for describing those things that are not Christian. And while within modern religious practice, Satanism and paganism are two overlapping but distinct religious traditions, these responses are a perfect example of where the concept of what is pagan exists within the Christian imagination. And especially as we're living in a time of all kinds of culture war, Pagans, in the modern sense, really have to be conscious of that we are deliberately taking up a term that is used as a way of otherizing, diminishing, and otherwise marginalizing a particular set of spiritual practices, and was one that, by the way, was then used for referring to a lot of other groups, not just including the polytheists of Europe. So how did this otherizing happen to what was originally the dominant group of religions within Europe and the Mediterranean basin? Christianity, up to the time of the Emperor Constantine, was a fairly persistent, somewhat growing, but definitely minority and in some cases fringe religious movement within the Roman Empire. They stood out in that they rejected all the gods that everyone else was perfectly okay with blending, mixing, matching, or ignoring as they felt was appropriate. They, somewhat rightly, protested injustices within the Roman Empire like slavery, while not so justly harassing worshippers of other religious groups as they were on their way to temple or festival or whatever other form of worship it was they were doing. This tended to be one of the things that got Christians in trouble when they weren't doing things like refusing to give recognition to the imperial cult. As is pointed out in The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie, the scale of actual martyrdom in terms of Christians being killed by the Roman state for being Christians or something similar was exaggerated. This was in part because Christianity, especially at the time, but also sort of generally throughout its history, has preached the concept of what's referred to as the crown of martyrdom. What this refers to is that anyone who dies in the name of Christianity gets to skip Judgment Day and all that business and go straight to the right hand of God. St. Augustine even wrote his own polemics against similar groups like this in what was at the time Roman North Africa, where he decried the existence of Christian sects who glorified seeking different forms of martyrdom as nothing more than elaborate suicide. Now, Augustine, it has to be noted, was writing much later within this process of where Christianity's become dominant. But I think it is important to point to this, that this was something of a tendency that existed within the Christian movement throughout its early history, of where the ideas of instant salvation, if you die in the name of Christianity, probably did to an extent encourage worshipers to engage in escalation of confrontation or otherwise seek death as a release from the hardships of life, as some way of gaining glory, or any number of other similar outcomes. These frictions and tensions escalated as the political situation within the Roman Empire deteriorated during what's referred to as the crisis of the 3rd century, a close to 100-year period where nearly every emperor within that period was put on the throne by virtue of military force and fighting various kinds of civil wars against other claimants. The breakdown of the empire paralleled the increasing acts of persecution against Christian populations in a way that's not unlike what you see in many other instances, like the 30 Years' War and the rise of witch hunts within Europe during the Protestant Reformation, where the breakdown of broader society brings about the escalation of religious tensions. Constantine came to power on the tail end of all of this. He was preceded by Diocletian, who managed to mostly stabilize and reunify the empire under a much more openly militaristic and authoritarian government. But even Diocletian failed to effectively hand over power in a way that didn't lead to immediate civil war. So Constantine came to power in the fashion that many of his predecessors had, with the twist of the so-called miracle at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, where Constantine is famously said to have prayed for a blessing before battle and then looked up in the heavens, saw a cross or some other similar kind of Christian symbol, and was greeted with the words, "Under this sign you will conquer." Under the sign of the cross, Constantine and his troops won at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, making Constantine the new emperor of a united Roman Empire. Constantine's big contributions to this story are found in the form of the Council of Nicaea and the Edict of Toleration. The Council of Nicaea is where essentially what we know of as the Bible was first properly codified. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds here because this does get often depicted as Constantine imposing his vision on the council. And while certainly he had influence because he was the guy assembling the council and inviting the different bishops, the fact is the people he was inviting were people who were representative of different Christian communities throughout the empire, and not exactly like some fringe that he'd assembled to ram through a particular agenda. Nicaea was important because it created the Nicene Creed, effectively forged a unified Christian church of sorts. It's going to be a long time before that really happens, and that's a totally different topic for a completely different time. But effectively, this is what happens during this process, allowing for an institutionalization of Christianity and establishing a certain degree of uniformity within the creed. This was further assisted by the Edict of Toleration, which ended Roman state support for the different official imperial cults and their associated temples. This was something that was huge because, as I mentioned before, religion was very much a political matter. Within the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, the big temples of the civic gods and later the gods of the imperial cult were something that was a public affair and was supported by public funding. So Constantine withdrawing these resources was a significant blow to these existing establishments, as was his patronage and sponsorship of Christianity and the growing Christian community within the empire. What follows, as described by Nixie, is a period of increasing violence by Christian groups against the different pre-Christian groups who were now out of favor with the imperial government. The burning of the Library of Alexandria by Saint Cyril of Alexandria is an excellent example of this. The Serapeum of Alexandria had long been a center of what had been seen by Christians as pagan learning and pagan religious practice, which makes a certain amount of sense as the Serapeum, the term that was properly used for the Great Library, was as much a religious institution as it was a place of higher learning. The Roman governor, while Christian, sought to maintain a careful balance between the different Christian groups and the non-Christian groups within the Roman province of Egypt. A desire that failed when Cyril and his followers sacked the Serapeum, killed Hypatia, and effectively settled the question through violence. This was not unique, and prescriptions by different Christian emperors against non-Christian form of worship, including the effective banishment of the School of Athens, were as much a part of the advance of Christianity as conversion and support for the new religion by the government. Now, there certainly were people who voluntarily converted to Christianity. If there hadn't been, then the religious movement would never have gotten off the ground in the first place. However, what is important here to talk about when we're discussing the initial conversion of the Roman Empire and this particular period is that the myth that's often handed down is Christianity gained toleration, and then everybody just saw that the old pagan faiths weren't worth following anymore, so they threw in with the new, more redeeming and empowering form of religious practice that was Christianity at the time. This discounts that there were polytheists who wrote their own extensive rebuttals against the encroaching new religion. There were people like the last school of Athens who migrated under the reign of the Emperor Justinian to what is now present-day Iran in search of shelter and toleration, and communities who held on that to varying extents faced growing amounts of coercion. The story is really complicated and one that deserves far more time than I can give it here within this particular podcast. But suffice to say, the general myth of Christianity came and then just broke the old pagan chains within the Roman Empire is a bit off. It does, however, form a critical component of how Christianity justifies itself as this liberatory force that came and ended the bad old pagan days. This necessarily also means that those bad old days have to have been bad, even though the actual facts are quite a bit more complicated. Now, Christianity after the conversion of the Roman Empire is a somewhat different beast, because now we have the development of what's going to become the Catholic Church, what's going to be the schism between the Western Catholic and Eastern Orthodox branches of Christianity, and all kinds of other stuff that really you could do a whole podcast series on all by itself. What's different here is that a lot of the work is happening either on the fringes of Roman power or extending outside the bounds of the empire itself. Now, there are some instances of Christian conversion within this period that are mostly peaceful, with Ireland being an excellent example of where the coming of Christianity brought about a period of increasing syncretism and overlap and the development of a unique Celtic church within the world of Christendom. The case of Ireland, however, is a bit more the exception than the rule. Much of the conversion efforts that start beginning in Central Europe and what is the present-day Low Countries known as Belgium and the Netherlands was a project of religious imperialism reaching beyond the bounds of the Roman Empire, such as St. Boniface's destruction of Donau's Oak in Germany or the burning of the Irminsul, to active political and religious imperialism under the Emperor Charlemagne, who mounted multiple campaigns, first in what were known as the Frisian Wars, followed by the Saxon Wars, where Carolingian Franks waged war against the non-Christian, Frisian-speaking, and Germanic-speaking peoples of what is sort of now today Western Germany, and the Netherlands, and Belgium. When I'm talking bloody, I'm talking Christian chroniclers in a collection often referred to as the Two Lives of Charlemagne approvingly described one instance of Charlemagne showing his power over the Saxons. That's known as the Verdict of Verdun. At the Verdict of Verdun, Charlemagne gathered together a group of Saxon nobles who, under pain of death and conquest, agreed to be baptized as Christians. Once these men had been baptized as Christians, Charlemagne's troops then proceeded to slaughter them all, as they were seen as a danger to Charlemagne's imperial policy within the region. Chroniclers approvingly described how so many Saxons were slain that the river Verdun ran red with blood. This is sort of the tone that's going to be set for going into Central Europe, Scandinavia, and the Baltic Basin, where a combination of coerced conversion and forcing some kind of political compromise in the name of accepting the cross was used as the carrot, in contrast with the stick of outright military invasion, whether by Christian lords of the European continent, as Otto I did in Denmark, or by the actions of ambitious nobles like Olaf Tryggvason, who used the imprimatur of Christianity to impose their own particular kind of monarchy and rule over their chosen realms. Figures like Tryggvason were also resisted both by people within the lands they claimed as theirs and by their neighbors, as shown by instances like the Battle of Svolder, where Olaf Tryggvason was ambushed on his flagship by a coalition of Swedish, Danish, and rebellious Norse nobles who wished to see an end to his rule. This kind of violence wasn't always the case. The king Hakon the Good of Norway became known as the Good because while he professed Christianity, he did not seek to impose it forcefully on the people of Norway, and according to the saga The Hakonarmal, is reported to have, though again, keeping in mind that this was composed by a heathen skald, to have said, well, bury me in a heathen fashion, since I seem to have mostly lived a heathen life. And then there's a snippet where he's welcomed into the Hall of the Gods after his death for preserving the temples and sacred rites. What matters is that which is described as heathen or pagan or otherwise outside of Christianity is no longer a question of people living within the same society as the Christians. They are people who are safely described as outsiders who have to either be subjugated or destroyed. This is a pattern that continues into what's referred to as the Eastern Crusades, where orders like the Knights Teutonic, the Sword Brethren, and others launched some pretty ferociously, let's kill a whole bunch of people and do some crimes against humanity stuff into what is modern-day Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. All of which was in the name of spreading the light of the sweet baby Jesus, and even persisted after the king of Lithuania accepted Christian baptism. A case could be made that this whole process was what effectively taught Christian civilization how to do imperialism. Even though conversion happened, the process itself tended to focus more on getting people at the top and then expecting those social elites to steadily Christianize the people under their power. This was, as you can imagine, an uneven process, especially because many of these different feudal lords were being given the choice of either you bring down the retribution of the Lord upon these ungodly practices, which people are still doing around harvests and planting and all these other things that are necessary for keeping themselves alive, and face the risk of revolt by the peasants, or you let them do stuff with the corn dollies and the green man and all that because it keeps them happy and you can talk fast enough with the local priest to get them to back off, and they're still bringing the food in instead of using those pitchforks to bring you in. As was the case in the Roman Empire, the heathen, which is about where this term starts really showing up, people of the heath, of the countryside, is similar to the pagan, the rural rustic, the person who's backward and behind. Because as was the case in the Roman Empire, as also became the case across the European continent, that Christianity's spread tended to go through centers of power and from important nodes of communication and commerce and spread out, as opposed to being something that truly swelled up from below. This also doesn't really jive well with the myths that Christianity uses to justify itself. As it says in Romans 14:11, "As surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me, every tongue will acknowledge God." Christianity's myth is one of voluntary acceptance, that people saw the light, were forever changed, and came around because Christianity was surely the superior version. It's a narrative that also doesn't allow for the pesky truth that Christianity's coming was thanks to how the institutional elements of the religious practice cut a deal with people in positions of power and became instruments for exerting power over others. A Faustian bargain, if there ever was one. So where does that leave pagans in this story, modern as well as pre-modern. Well, this is where we can see what gives meat to this idea of paganness being the ultimate other, being that thing which is an offense to Christianity simply by existing. Because really, when you think about it, how else are you going to be able to justify what was actually done to bring these different groups to heel? You have to say that what they did was licentious, was sinful, was depraved, was unconscionable, was unspeakably cruel. And while certainly these different societies had many different aspects that were inexcusable for their own varying reasons, at least from a modern perspective, there's a vast gulf between what is described as being irretrievably evil and in need of being blotted out and what actually was going on in these different societies. In a lot of ways, terms like pagan and satanic, as used by many Christians, become a useful way of dodging this messier truth, where in the hands of a pagan practitioner, words like pagan, heathen, and witch become powerful symbols, become touchstones, become ways of stating an affirmative identity that is rejecting many of the problems that have emerged within Christianity. For Christians who are feeling a bit insecure about their religion's place in the world, it becomes a thought-terminating cliche. It becomes a term that only needs to be trotted out as a way of silencing any further discussion and foreclosing further exploration. Saying all that which was pagan was the bad old days means you don't have to look back. That carries through into the present. Now, this is where I'm going to get into that thing I mentioned before about dogs and cats. Because I think that this history has a significant impact on relations between pagans and Christians. Now, in the case of many, though not all modern pagans, there is a lot of baggage and trauma that comes from mainstream religion, particularly Christianity. Many heathens that I've met, for example, are folks who came right out of high control Christian denominations or other really conservative, borderline fascist, and Christian nationalist elements. So this means on the pagan side that even for folks who aren't directly coming out of that kind of background, there still is a lot of general baggage, especially because mainstream Christianity, especially since Donald Trump became a thing and Viktor Orban became the strongman in Hungary, along with many other things, that Christianity has been getting increasingly, well, at least in the more extreme right-wing elements, aggressive. And when I say aggressive, this is an escalation on what the religious right and other groups have been doing since before I was born. What this means is, for anyone who's having this conversation, there's a lot of bad vibes that have flooded the field. On the pagan side, there's a lot of understandable trauma, as well as suspicion that is brought on by actions of different Christian groups, whereas Christians, even from necessarily more progressive and inclusive backgrounds, still have some of that baggage floating around of, well, pagan is the bad thing, right? Now, certainly, there are much more inclusive and progressive Christians who can see past that. But that still is part of what's going on here. Essentially, what you have is two different sets of cultural understandings that operate on their own you could say, body language of sorts, of these implied assumptions about how one is supposed to communicate, which, like I said before, is kind of like cats and dogs, with the classic example being how cats and dogs use their tails. When cats whip their tails around in rapid motion, it tends to be as part of hunting or other more potentially aggressive activities, whereas when they're relaxed, the tail tends to be wrapped up or at rest. Whereas with dogs, the tail wagging is, hey, things are happy, let's play. A difference of communication that leads to understandable problems, at least between cats and dogs that don't know each other. Now add on top of that metaphor the different weight that's being attached by people in these different groups to this understanding, and you can see why there's already room for a lot of friction. And that's before I start talking about people like Glenn Beck and Christian nationalists and lots of other similar groups who are acting with a bit more malice. No matter how you slice it, it is an inescapable fact that the Christian right, at least in the United States, has been increasingly leaning back into that bad old days of understanding of paganism as a way of rallying their followers and cultivating support within their denominations. This past April, The Wild Hunt did a breakdown of a book titled Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come, by one John Daniel Davidson, who was interviewed on April 4th by Glenn Beck, the American conservative commentator, radio host, and general influencer on the American right, and particularly Christian elements of the American right. Davidson himself is the senior editor of The Federalist, a right-wing American online website who is known to pagan world for claiming that Greta Thunberg is somehow a pagan Joan of Arc figure. You can get the whole write-up at the link to the article, which is included in the show description, but the short version is the book Pagan America is very much about how Christianity is under threat, and the changing woke culture is representing the demise of good Christian values, and that all of this will soon be under siege by what he calls pagan, using the word pagan quite clearly not to represent the religious movement as it is, but rather as Christianity has long used the term, as a way of saying all that which we are not. This is also not a unique opinion. I've included some examples, including a guest essay from the New York Times titled, "Is the West Becoming Pagan Again?" Post-Christendom and the Return of Paganism in the West, published with National Catholic Register, and the infamous The Return of the Pagans, published in The Atlantic this past December 2023. It wouldn't be hard to go through some of these articles and replace every reference to the term pagan with left or progressive or whatever other term you prefer. What matters is this represents a circling of the wagons, a drawing together of Christianity's most reactionary elements and what they see as a war against all these things that Christianity is not. That the changing of society, that opening things up to a more inclusive stance is something that poses an existential threat to Christianity's continued existence that must be fought tooth and nail. And this is the part where I'm going to talk for a minute about Project 2025, better known as the Heritage Foundation's Handbook for How to Do Christian Fascism in the United States of America. Now, to my knowledge, the document does not go on at length about the danger of pagans or encroaching paganism. That said, the same siege mentality that's on display by these different figures who are decrying the dangers of what they see as a creeping resurgent paganism is all there. However, many of the authoritarian measures that exist throughout Project 2025, including purging the civil service, providing support for Christianity as it is understood, and generally advancing what are seen as Christian principles in government, all are symptoms of a religion, or at least a fraction of a religion, that sees itself as under attack, under threat, and in need of taking extreme measures to preserve themselves. This is, of course, despite the fact that the attack in question is merely people asking for the dominance of Christianity and groups associating with Christianity to stop keeping their heads shoved underwater and keeping them from being able to catch a breath. The problem, when you look at the logic of Project 2025 and the kinds of Christianity that surround it, is not that there's a genuine threat to Christianity's dominant position within American society. It's that a potential threat, as they see it, exists at all. It is a mentality which treats the presence of dissent as an existential danger to the entire project. This is also a mentality that's dangerous to members of minority religious communities, including the modern pagan movement, the witchcraft movement, and other similar groups. When any possible dissension or deviation from the expected norm of this kind of muscular, aggressive, imperial Christian dominance is no longer considered acceptable, then that means anyone who deviates, but especially those who are not under the cross at all, are in danger. Their rhetoric makes it clear that anything they do not like isn't just something that is a difference of religious opinion. It is a manifestation of an otherness that is inherently dangerous to Christianity's existence. Otherwise, how is that whole myth of every knee bowing and every tongue acknowledging gonna hold up? So where does this leave modern pagans? People who have deliberately and consciously taken on a badge that effectively says to particularly this brand of Christianity, I am what you despise. I am in revolt against all these things that you see as essential, and I question many of your core assumptions about religious practice. I also, to your discomfort, force the conversation about how you, Christian, got to where you are now. It means we need to stop treating what we see as spiritual practice as simply a form of spiritual practice. We need to take it into our lives in a way that includes acknowledging that we are, whether we want to or not, effectively in opposition to everything that is coming out of the reactionary right and reactionary Christianity. Their gender essentialism, their exploitation of the earth's natural resources with no regard for the needs of ecosystems around the world beyond human consumption. Their support for authoritarian, tyrannical, and hegemonic forms of politics, which eliminate the possibility of a pluralistic or free society of any kind. If we are going to be wearing the term pagan as an identifier and as a badge of honor, or heathen, or whatever other term it is that you use that's within that general universe of spiritual practice, then I think it's time for us to stop pretending that we can do this in a way that's apolitical. Not when the most vigorous and aggressive branches of Christianity, in terms of picking up converts and developing support, are the ones that also are the most interested in bringing Christ by the sword. I've always felt, to some extent or another, that the pagan movement is one that broadly should align with the interests of progress and improving human dignity. I think now, especially with everything that's been happening in the past decade or so, there's no longer any question there. I know there are many pagans who affiliate with these movements of reaction and return to tradition, but these are people who have tied themselves to a broader movement which will happily exterminate them at the first possible opportunity or even excuse. I'd say it's time to pick sides, but the fact is, for anyone who says their spirituality honors the earth, respects a pluralistic approach to religion, is welcoming of gender expression that runs a spectrum rather than a fixed binary, and is perfectly encouraging of sexuality in all its healthy forms, then really the side has already been picked for us, whether we want to or not. The act of being pagan is something that has always had a certain political edge to it that I think hasn't been fully appreciated or understood in this movement. But now, that edge has become a capital P political. And if you're going to be a capital P pagan, then that's the world we're living in now. And in this triptych on this broader topic, I'm going to get into what that means for the modern pagan living in 2024. So thank you for listening and tuning in. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.